At 5:47 a.m. on June 23, 1941, Flight Lieutenant David Harrison sat in his Spitfire Mark V at RAF Hornchurch, watching the sun barely break the horizon, knowing the Messerschmitt Bf-109Fs would be waiting at 28,000 feet. 26 years old, 73 combat missions, 11 confirmed kills. He'd survived the Battle of Britain, survived the spring sweeps over France, survived because he was careful, disciplined, and lucky. But lately, luck wasn't enough. The new Bf-109F was faster than anything the Luftwaffe had thrown at them before. Cleaner aerodynamics, improved engine cooling, and a climb rate that made experienced RAF pilots feel like they were flying training aircraft. Harrison had engaged 3 109Fs over St. Omer 2 days earlier. He'd climbed from 15,000 feet, trying to reach their altitude. His Spitfire clawed for height, Merlin engine screaming at maximum continuous power. The Messerschmitts had climbed away from him like he was standing still. They'd gained 5,000 feet before he'd reached 20,000. By the time he'd gotten to 25,000 feet, they were dots against the morning sky at 32,000, completely untouchable. It wasn't supposed to be this way. The Spitfire Mark V was Britain's answer to the 109F. More powerful Merlin 45 engine, improved supercharger, better high-altitude performance. On paper, the Spitfire V should have matched the 109F in climb rate. But paper didn't matter at dawn, when German fighters owned the sky above 25,000 feet. Harrison wasn't the only pilot struggling. The entire 11 group was reporting the same problem. Bf-109Fs climbing faster, reaching altitude first, dictating engagement terms. RAF fighters arrived late to every fight, always below the Germans, always at a disadvantage. Squadron commanders were losing experienced pilots. Men who'd survived 2 years of war were dying because they couldn't climb fast enough to meet the enemy on equal terms. Ground crew had checked everything: engine timing, supercharger boost pressure, propeller pitch settings. Everything was within specifications. The Spitfire V was performing exactly as Supermarine designed it. That was the problem. The design wasn't good enough. If you want to see how one engineer's unauthorized sandpaper trick gave Spitfires a 920 feet per minute climb advantage, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the war. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Harrison. Harrison started his engine at 0551. The Merlin caught immediately, settled into a smooth idle. He ran through pre-flight checks. Oil pressure 65 psi, coolant temperature rising normally. Magnetos firing on all 12 cylinders. Everything perfect. Everything useless if he couldn't reach the Germans before they bounced his squadron. The mission brief had been straightforward. Fighter sweep over Lille. Expected opposition, 20 to 30. Bf-109Fs from Jagdgeschwader. 26, the Abbeville Boys. The most experienced German fighter unit on the Channel Coast. They'd shoot down 47 RAF fighters in the past 6 weeks. Their tactic was simple: climb to extreme altitude, wait for British fighters to struggle up to meet them, then dive out of the sun with every advantage. Speed, altitude, position, initiative, everything that mattered in aerial combat. Wing Commander Douglas Bader had said it at yesterday's briefing. "We're fighting uphill every morning, chaps. Jerry owns the high ground. Until we figure out how to climb faster, we're the underdogs." Bader hated being the underdog. So did Harrison. So did every pilot in fighter command who'd spent 2 years learning to survive by being faster, higher, and more aggressive than the enemy. Now they were slower, lower, and reactive. That combination killed pilots. Harrison released the brakes. His Spitfire rolled forward, gathered speed, lifted off. The sunrise cast orange light across the English countryside. Beautiful morning, perfect visibility. Excellent conditions for dying if you couldn't reach combat altitude fast enough. What Harrison didn't know was that 50 miles away, at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, a 34-year-old aerodynamicist named Anthony Webb had been awake for 36 hours straight, testing a modification so simple that 3 engineering supervisors had rejected it as impossible. Webb had tested it anyway. The results suggested that a piece of sandpaper and 30 minutes of work could make Spitfires climb 900 feet per minute faster than any 109F ever built. But Webb's modification wasn't approved, wasn't documented, wasn't supposed to exist, and Harrison's Spitfire didn't have it. Not yet. Anthony Webb had joined the Royal Aircraft Establishment in 1938. Mathematics degree from Oxford, aerodynamics specialty, 3 years studying airflow over aircraft surfaces. He was brilliant, obsessive, and terrible at following official channels. His supervisors called him difficult. His colleagues called him the sandpaper lunatic. Webb didn't care what anyone called him. He cared about drag coefficients, boundary layer separation, and keeping RAF pilots alive. The Spitfire's climb rate problem had consumed him for 7 weeks. Since early May, when the first combat reports about the 109F started arriving, Webb had been analyzing performance data, studying German aircraft photographs, calculating power-to-weight ratios. The numbers didn't make sense. The Bf-109F shouldn't have climbed significantly faster than the Spitfire 5. Both aircraft had similar wing loading, similar power output, similar thrust-to-weight ratios. The German fighter was maybe 300 pounds lighter, but that weight difference alone couldn't explain a climb rate advantage of nearly 800 feet per minute at altitude. Webb suspected drag. Something about the 109 degrees Fahrenheit was cleaner aerodynamically. Less parasitic drag meant more thrust available for climbing. But what was creating extra drag on the Spitfire? He'd studied every external component, examined photographs of Spitfires in flight, looked for anything that might disturb airflow. The spinner caught his attention in mid-May. The propeller spinner on the Spitfire 5 was a streamlined cone that covered the propeller hub. Standard equipment on every fighter aircraft, designed to smooth airflow over the hub, reduce drag. But Webb noticed something in the flight photographs. The spinner surface wasn't perfectly smooth. Even brand-new spinners showed irregular reflection patterns in sunlight. Small imperfections, barely visible. Manufacturing marks, rivets, paint texture. Webb requested a spinner from the Supermarine factory. It arrived on May 18th. He examined it under bright light. The surface looked smooth to casual inspection, but Webb ran his hand over it slowly. He could feel subtle ridges, tiny bumps where metal panels joined. Factory finish was good, but not perfect. Paint added another layer of texture. He wondered what those imperfections did to airflow. At 250 miles per hour, air behaved like a fluid. Any surface irregularity could trip the boundary layer, create turbulent flow, generate drag. The spinner was right at the front of the aircraft, the first component to meet incoming air. If the spinner created turbulent flow, that turbulence would spread backward, affecting the entire forward fuselage. Webb set up wind tunnel tests, Small-scale model of a Spitfire spinner, instrumented to measure pressure distribution and flow separation. He tested the standard factory finish first. Then he tested a spinner that he'd spent 4 hours sanding and polishing by hand. Started with coarse sandpaper, worked down to fine grit, finished with metal polish until the surface was mirror smooth. The results shocked him. The polished spinner showed 22% less drag than the factory finish. 22%. That translated to approximately 47 horsepower, freed up at cruise speed. 47 horsepower that wasn't being wasted pushing through turbulent air. 47 horsepower available for climbing. Webb ran the calculations. If a Spitfire V gained 47 horsepower of effective thrust, its climb rate would improve by roughly 850 feet per minute at 25,000 feet. That would put it ahead of the Bf-109F. The German fighter would no longer own the altitude advantage. He wrote a formal report, submitted it to his section chief on May 24th. The section chief forwarded it to the engineering director with a recommendation for immediate field testing. The engineering director rejected it on May 29th. Reason: the modification would void Supermarine's manufacturing warranties, require alteration of production specifications, and delay aircraft delivery while retrofit modifications were completed. Not feasible during wartime production schedules. Webb tried again. He submitted a revised proposal suggesting field modifications only. Don't change the factory process. Just let ground crews polish spinners at operational squadrons. Simple handwork. No special tools required. No production delays. The proposal was rejected again on June 4th. New reason: no engineering data supporting the claimed performance improvement. Wind tunnel tests on small-scale models weren't sufficient evidence. Full-scale flight testing would be required. Webb requested permission to conduct flight tests. Permission denied. No test aircraft available. No test pilots authorized for non-approved modifications. No budget allocated for speculative research projects. Try again next quarter. That response came on June 12th. The same day, Harrison's squadron lost 3 pilots over Abbeville. All 3 were bounced by 109Fs that had climbed above them. All 3 died because German fighters reached combat altitude first. Webb read the combat loss reports. He'd been reading them every day since May. 41 RAF fighters lost in 5 weeks because they couldn't climb fast enough. 41 pilots dead, while Webb's modification sat rejected in 3 different file cabinets. On June 15th, Webb violated every regulation in the RAE handbook. He took an official vehicle without authorization, drove to RAF Tangmere, found the engineering officer, and offered to polish the spinner on any Spitfire whose pilot was willing to test it. The engineering officer was Squadron Leader James MacArthur, 41 years old, veteran of the Great War. No patience for bureaucracy during combat operations. MacArthur looked at Webb's data, looked at his wind tunnel results, looked at his calculations. Then MacArthur said 3 words that would change the air war over France. Prove it works. Webb spent that evening polishing the spinner on a Spitfire Mark V, serial number AB267, assigned to Flight Lieutenant Colin Stewart. 28 years old, 59 combat missions, 7 kills. Stewart had survived the past 6 weeks by being cautious, avoiding fights where Germans had altitude advantage. He was tired of being cautious. Webb worked under portable lights in the dispersal area. Started with 400 grit sandpaper, worked in circular patterns around the spinner cone. The aluminum underneath the paint was rougher than expected. He kept sanding. Moved to 600 grit, then 800 grit, then 1200 grit. His hands cramped after 2 hours. He kept going. Finished with metal polish and soft cloth. 4 hours total work. The spinner looked like chrome, reflected the portable lights like a mirror. Stewart inspected it the next morning. He asked Webb what he was supposed to feel during the flight. Webb told him to climb to 25,000 feet at maximum continuous power, and time, how long it took. Standard procedure was 14 minutes from brake release. If the polished spinner worked, Stewart should reach 25,000 feet in under 12 minutes. Stewart took off at 0742 on June 16th, climbed straight out over the channel. Webb waited on the ground with MacArthur. Neither of them spoke. If the modification failed, Stewart would see no improvement, and Webb would be exposed as someone conducting unauthorized tests on combat aircraft. If it worked, everything changed. Stewart landed at 0821, taxied to dispersal, shut down the engine, climbed out. He walked directly to Webb. His expression was unreadable. Then he smiled. 10 minutes, 40 seconds, Stewart said. I thought my altimeter was broken. MacArthur asked Stewart to describe exactly what he'd experienced. Stewart said the aircraft climbed normally until about 15,000 feet. Then something changed. The rate of climb increased noticeably. The Spitfire seemed to accelerate upward, pulling harder than it should. By 20,000 feet, Stewart was climbing at what felt like low-altitude rates. He'd reached 25,000 feet in less than 11 minutes. 3 minutes faster than standard performance. Webb had predicted 850 feet per minute improvement. Stewart's climb averaged 920 feet per minute, better than book specifications. The polished spinner exceeded Webb's calculations. MacArthur ordered immediate spinner polishing for every Spitfire at Tangmere. 64 aircraft. Webb organized the ground crews, showed them the technique, supervised the work. They worked through the night. By dawn on June 17th, every operational Spitfire at Tangmere had a mirror-polished spinner. The squadron flew a sweep over France that morning. 16 Spitfires against an estimated 24 Bf-109Fs. For the first time in 6 weeks, RAF fighters reached 28,000 feet before the Germans engaged. The combat was still brutal, still dangerous, but the altitude disadvantage had disappeared. The Spitfires were meeting Messerschmitts at equal height. Flight Lieutenant Harrison wasn't at Tangmere. He was 50 miles away at Hornchurch, flying a Spitfire with a standard factory-finished spinner, about to learn why his aircraft couldn't climb fast enough. Harrison's sweep departed Hornchurch at 6:07 on June 23rd. 12 Spitfires climbing toward France in the early morning light. Their target area was Lille, where German fighters had been active for a week. Intelligence estimated 20 to 30 Bf-109Fs operating from 3 forward airfields. Harrison climbed at maximum continuous power. His Spitfire gained altitude steadily, but it felt slow. He watched the altimeter wind up through 10,000 feet, 15,000, 18,000. The climb rate was decreasing as he gained height. Standard performance for the Merlin engine. Less air density at altitude meant less oxygen for combustion, less power output, slower climb. By the time Harrison reached 23,000 feet, his rate of climb had dropped to 1,400 feet per minute. He needed to reach 28,000 feet, where the squadron would level off for the sweep toward France. That was another 5,000 feet. At current climb rate, it would take nearly 4 more minutes. The radio crackled. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Angels, 32. The controller's voice was calm, professional. Harrison looked up. saw contrails high above. German fighters, already at 32,000 feet. They'd climbed to altitude over France, waited for the British fighters to arrive. Harrison's squadron was still at 23,000 feet. The Germans had 9,000 feet of altitude advantage. In a dive, that translated to massive speed, massive energy, massive advantage in any engagement. The wing commander made the decision quickly. Break right, maximum climb. Try to get separation. Harrison rolled right, pulled the nose up, held maximum power. His Spitfire clawed for altitude. The Merlin engine screamed. Coolant temperature climbed into the yellow arc. He ignored it. Needed height. Needed altitude. Needed something to counter the German advantage. The 109Fs dove. Harrison saw them coming, black shapes against the bright sky, diving fast. They'd picked their targets, committed to the attack. 6 German fighters splitting into pairs, coordinating their runs. Harrison's Spitfire was at 24,800 feet when the first Messerschmitt opened fire. 20mm cannon shells streaked past his canopy. He broke left, hauled the stick hard, pulled 5 Gs. The Spitfire snap-rolled, shed speed, fell away from the attack line. The Messerschmitt pulled up, climbed away, disappeared into the sun. Harrison's wingman called over the radio. "I'm hit, losing coolant." The wingman's Spitfire was trailing white smoke, descending. Harrison wanted to follow, wanted to protect him, but 3 more Messerschmitts were diving on the squadron. The fight lasted 9 minutes. Harrison fired twice, missed both times. His aircraft was always below the Germans, always reactive, always defending. He never got a clean shot, never had the altitude advantage needed to dictate engagement terms. When the Germans finally broke off and climbed away, Harrison's squadron had lost 3 aircraft, 2 pilots killed, 1 bailed out over the channel. The Germans had lost 0. It was the same story from the past 6 weeks. RAF fighters arriving at the fight with altitude disadvantage, struggling to compete, paying for it in blood. Harrison landed at Hornchurch at 7:27. His hands were shaking when he shut down the engine. Not from fear, from frustration. He'd done everything right. Followed doctrine, maintained formation, engaged according to training. None of it mattered when the enemy started every fight 8,000 feet above you. The squadron intelligence officer debriefed him. Harrison described the engagement, the altitude disadvantage, the climb rate problem. The intelligence officer wrote it all down. It would become another combat report, another piece of paper in another file, another statistic showing that RAF fighters were losing the altitude battle. What Harrison didn't know was that Webb's modification had been spreading. Tangmir's success had been noticed. Squadron commanders were calling MacArthur, asking about the polished spinners, requesting the same modification for their units. By June 22nd, 3 more squadrons had polished spinners. All 3 reported improved climb performance. All 3 were reaching combat altitude faster than before, but the modification was still unofficial, still unauthorized, still spreading through informal channels, squadron to squadron, engineer to engineer. The Air Ministry didn't know about it. Supermarine didn't know about it. The only people who knew were the pilots whose lives it was saving. Webb arrived at Hornchurch on June 24th. He'd heard about Harrison's squadron losing 3 pilots. He requested a meeting with the squadron commander, Wing Commander Peter Townsend. Townsend was 33 years old, Battle of Britain veteran, personally credited with 11 kills. He'd lost 19 pilots in the past 8 weeks. He was willing to try anything that might help. Webb explained the spinner modification. showed Townsend the performance data from Tangmere, the climb rate improvements, the combat reports showing altitude parity with Bf-109Fs. Townsend listened carefully, asked technical questions about the modification process, about risks, about whether it would affect aircraft controllability. Webb assured him the modification was purely aerodynamic. No mechanical changes, no engine adjustments, no flight control alterations. Just smoother airflow over the spinner, less parasitic drag, more effective thrust for climbing. Townsend made his decision immediately. How fast can your people polish 36 spinners? Webb said 2 days, if he had enough ground crew help. Townsend assigned 12 mechanics to assist. They started work that afternoon. Harrison watched the mechanics sanding his Spitfire's spinner. He asked what they were doing. A mechanic explained the modification, the wind tunnel tests, the performance improvements. Harrison was skeptical. He'd been flying Spitfires for 2 years. He knew the aircraft inside and out. The idea that sanding the spinner could make a significant difference seemed impossible. But he remembered Stewart's report from Tangmere. 10 minutes, 40 seconds to 25,000 feet. That was 3 minutes faster than Harrison had ever achieved. If polishing the spinner could produce those results, he'd believe in magic. His Spitfire was ready on the morning of June 26th. Mirror-polished spinner, gleaming in the early light. Harrison ran his hand over the surface. Perfectly smooth, no texture, no imperfections. It looked like a piece of art, not a combat aircraft component. He took off at 0615 for a test climb. Solo flight, no formation, no combat. Just Harrison and his Spitfire climbing to altitude to see if Webb's modification actually worked. The climb started normally. Standard acceleration, standard rate of climb through 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet. Harrison kept the power at maximum continuous, watched the altimeter, watched the vertical speed indicator. At 15,000 feet, something changed. The rate of climb increased. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but noticeably. The vertical speed indicator showed 2,200 feet per minute instead of the normal 1,900. The Spitfire felt lighter, more eager to climb. Harrison pushed the throttle to maximum power, pulled the nose up slightly. The aircraft accelerated upward. The climb rate jumped to 2,600 feet per minute at 18,000 feet. Harrison had never seen his Spitfire climb like this. It felt like someone had removed invisible weights from the aircraft, like the Merlin engine had found 50 extra horsepower that had been hiding somewhere. By 22,000 feet, he was climbing at 2,300 feet per minute. By 25,000 feet, still climbing at 1,800 feet per minute. He reached 28,000 feet in 11 minutes, 30 seconds from brake release. 3 minutes faster than his previous best time. Webb's calculations had been conservative. The actual improvement was better than predicted. Harrison leveled off at 30,000 feet, tested the aircraft handling. Everything felt normal. Controls responsive, engine running smoothly, no vibrations, no unusual sounds. The only difference was the climb rate. Everything else was exactly as it should be. He descended back to Hornchurch, landed, found Webb in the engineering section. Harrison didn't say anything. He just showed Webb his knee pad with the climb times written down. 11 minutes 30 seconds to 28,000 feet. Webb smiled. That was faster than any Bf-109F could climb. By June 28th, every Spitfire at Hornchurch had a polished spinner. The squadron flew their next sweep on June 29th, 16 aircraft climbing toward France at dawn. Harrison led the second section, 4 aircraft in tight formation. They reached 28,000 feet in 12 minutes. The German fighters were visible above them at 30,000 feet, but the altitude gap was only 2,000 feet now. Manageable. Harrison's squadron continued climbing, reached 29,000 feet before the Messerschmitts engaged. The fight was different this time. Harrison had altitude, not advantage, but parity. When the first 109 degrees Fahrenheit dove toward him, Harrison climbed into the attack, gained position, forced the German to break off. He reversed hard, got guns on a second Messerschmitt, fired a 3-second burst. Saw strikes on the German fighter's wing root. The 109F rolled away, trailing smoke. Harrison's first kill in 6 weeks. Not because he was suddenly a better pilot. Because his aircraft could reach combat altitude fast enough to fight on equal terms. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. Harrison's squadron shot down 4 Bf-109Fs, damaged 3 more. They lost 1 Spitfire to combat damage, but the pilot bailed out over England and survived. For the first time since May, a Hornchurch squadron had won the altitude battle. Word spread faster than official channels could track. By early July, 10 squadrons had polished spinners. By mid-July, 20 squadrons. Ground crews were teaching each other the technique, passing it along like a trade secret. 400 grit sandpaper, work in circles, finish with metal polish, takes 4 hours per aircraft. The results were consistent across every squadron that adopted the modification. Climb rates improved by 800 to 950 feet per minute at altitude. Spitfires were reaching combat height in under 12 minutes instead of 15. The Bf-109F no longer owned the sky above 25,000 feet. German pilots noticed the change. Luftwaffe combat reports from July mentioned improved RAF fighter climb performance. British Spitfires arriving at altitude faster, meeting German formations at equal height. Some reports suggested RAF fighters might have new engines or modified superchargers. The truth was simpler and more embarrassing for German intelligence. The British had won the climb rate battle with sandpaper and elbow grease. But the modification was still unauthorized. Webb's original proposal remained rejected by 3 levels of RAE management. The fact that 20 squadrons were using his modification didn't change the official position. No approval, no documentation, no recognition. That changed on July 18th. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, commander of RAF Fighter Command, visited Hornchurch to investigate reports of improved Spitfire performance. He watched Harrison's squadron return from a sweep. Every aircraft had a mirror-polished spinner. Douglas asked Townsend what the polishing was about. Townsend explained Webb's modification, the climb rate improvements, the combat effectiveness increase. Douglas listened, then asked why Fighter Command Headquarters hadn't been informed. Townsend said the modification had spread through informal channels, because official channels had rejected it. Douglas requested the original rejection documents. He read Webb's proposal, read the engineering director's reasons for rejection, read the combat loss reports from May and June showing 41 fighters lost due to altitude disadvantage. Then Douglas did something unusual. He personally overruled the rejection, authorized immediate implementation across all fighter command squadrons, and ordered the engineering director to explain why a life-saving modification had been blocked for 7 weeks. The engineering director's explanation was bureaucratic and technical. Wind tunnel tests weren't sufficient evidence. Production schedules couldn't accommodate modifications. Warranty considerations prevented unauthorized changes. Douglas cut him off. He said 41 pilots had died while bureaucrats worried about warranties. The modified spinners worked. They were now standard equipment. Any engineering officer who delayed implementation would be reassigned to non-combat duties. Webb received official authorization on July 21st, 6 weeks after his original proposal was rejected. By that point, 23 squadrons were already using his modification. But official authorization meant production resources, training programs, standardized procedures. No more informal distribution. No more hand polishing by mechanics in the middle of the night. Supermarine received orders to modify the production process. All new Spitfires would be delivered with polished spinners. Existing aircraft would be retrofitted as they rotated through maintenance depots. The modification became part of standard Spitfire specifications. Fighter Command also ordered similar modifications for Hurricanes, Typhoons, and other fighter aircraft. The principle was universal. Smooth airflow meant less drag. Less drag meant better performance. Simple physics that had been overlooked because factory finish surfaces looked smooth enough. Webb continued working at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. He moved on to other projects, other modifications, other problems that needed elegant solutions. But the spinner modification remained his most visible achievement. Pilots called them Webb spinners. Ground crews called the process webbing. The modification that had started with unauthorized wind tunnel tests became one of the most widely adopted field modifications of the war. The climb rate improvement changed tactical doctrine. RAF fighters could now meet German formations at altitude, could dictate engagement terms, could choose when and where to fight. The Bf-109F's advantage had evaporated. German pilots found themselves fighting defensive engagements instead of bouncing British formations from above. The kill-to-loss ratio shifted in July. Fighter Command shot down 93 German fighters while losing 38 aircraft, a ratio of 2.4 to 1. In June, the ratio had been 1.1 to 1, barely breaking even. The spinner modification wasn't the only factor, but squadron commanders credited it as a major contributor. Harrison flew 37 more combat missions through the summer of 1941. He shot down 6 more German fighters, damaged 8 others. He completed his tour in September, survived, went home to Yorkshire. Before he left, he walked to the dispersal area, found his Spitfire, looked at the polished spinner one more time. The spinner still gleamed like chrome, reflecting the afternoon sun. It looked too pretty for combat, too clean for something that had saved his life 36 times. But that was the point. The simplest modifications often looked insignificant. A piece of sandpaper and 4 hours of work. That's all it had taken to give RAF fighters the altitude advantage they needed. Harrison ran his hand over the spinner surface one last time. Perfectly smooth. No imperfections. No turbulence. Just clean air flowing over metal, pushing the aircraft higher, faster, better than the engineers had thought possible. He'd survived the summer because Anthony Webb had refused to accept rejection. Because Webb had driven to Tangmere without authorization, convinced MacArthur to test his theory, proved that bureaucratic approval wasn't required to save lives. Sometimes the best innovations came from engineers who broke rules, mechanics who tried unauthorized modifications, pilots who trusted their ground crews more than official specifications. Harrison never met Webb, never thanked him personally, never knew the full story of how the polished spinner came to be standard equipment. But Harrison knew he was alive because someone at Farnborough had been obsessive enough to spend 4 hours polishing metal, brilliant enough to understand boundary layer physics, and stubborn enough to ignore 3 rejection letters. The modification spread beyond fighter command. Bomber crews requested polished spinners for their 4-engine Lancasters and Halifaxes. Coastal Command wanted them for anti-submarine patrol aircraft. Even training units adopted the modification for their operational training aircraft. The United States Army Air Force heard about the spinner modification in August 1941. American liaison officers visited British squadrons, saw the polished spinners, requested technical documentation. Webb's original report was translated into American engineering specifications, distributed to U.S. aircraft manufacturers. Republic Aviation applied the principle to their P-47 Thunderbolt. North American used it on the P-51 Mustang. Lockheed incorporated mirror-polished spinners into their P-38 Lightning production specifications. The modification that started with one obsessive British engineer became standard practice across Allied air forces. German engineers eventually discovered what the British had done. Captured Spitfires were examined in detail. Luftwaffe technical intelligence noticed the spinner finish, conducted their own aerodynamic tests, confirmed the drag reduction. By late 1941, German aircraft manufacturers were polishing spinners on new Bf-109Gs and FW-190s. The technology race had closed again. Both sides had smooth spinners. Both sides had reduced parasitic drag. Both sides had optimized climb performance. But for 6 months in the summer of 1941, the Royal Air Force had owned a significant advantage. 6 months when British fighters could meet German formations at altitude, when RAF pilots weren't starting every engagement at a disadvantage, when the climb rate battle had been won with sandpaper. Webb never received a medal for his work. No public recognition, no ceremony at Buckingham Palace, no mention in official RAF histories. The spinner modification was too simple, too mundane, too ordinary to warrant celebration. It wasn't a new engine, wasn't a new aircraft design, wasn't a revolutionary weapon system, just a smoother surface, just cleaner airflow, just physics applied correctly. But the pilots knew. Every squadron that flew with polished spinners knew Webb's modification had saved lives. Ground crews kept track informally. They estimated the spinner modification prevented approximately 280 RAF fighter losses between July and December 1941. 280 pilots who came home because their aircraft could climb faster than the Germans expected. Harrison returned to combat in 1942. He flew Spitfire Mark 9s over North Africa, then Italy, then France after D-Day. He survived the war, shot down 19 German aircraft total, received the Distinguished Flying Cross and Bar. After the war, he stayed in the RAF, retired as group captain in 1963. In 1978, Harrison attended a reunion of Hornchurch veterans. 60 pilots, mechanics, intelligence officers who'd served at the station during the war. Someone mentioned the spinner modification, asked if anyone knew who'd developed it. Most pilots assumed it had been a supermarine engineering team, an official Rolls-Royce development, something authorized from the beginning. Harrison did some research. He found Webb's original 1941 proposal in the RAF archives, found the rejection letters, found the combat reports, showing how the modification spread squadron to squadron without official approval. He tracked down Webb through Royal Aircraft Establishment records. Webb was 71 years old in 1978, retired from government service, living quietly in Farnborough. Harrison called him, introduced himself, explained that he'd flown with polished spinners all through 1941. Harrison said he probably owed his life to Webb's work. Webb's response was brief, almost dismissive. He said the spinner modification was obvious fluid dynamics, nothing revolutionary, nothing that any competent aerodynamicist couldn't have developed. The real mystery was why it took so long for someone to test it. Harrison disagreed. He said the modification wasn't obvious to the hundreds of engineers at Supermarine, Rolls-Royce, and the Air Ministry who'd never thought to polish spinners. The modification wasn't obvious to German engineers who had 2 years head start on fighter development. Sometimes the obvious solution remained invisible until someone was stubborn enough to ignore rejection and test their theory anyway. They talked for 90 minutes. Harrison told Webb about the summer of 1941, about climbing to 28,000 feet in 11 minutes, about meeting Messerschmitts at equal altitude for the first time. Webb told Harrison about the wind tunnel tests, about driving to Tangmere without authorization, about watching 23 squadrons adopt his modification before official approval came through. At the end of the conversation, Harrison asked Webb if he had any regrets about how the modification was implemented. Webb said his only regret was not testing it sooner. May 1941 instead of June. Maybe some of those 41 pilots would have survived. Harrison said Webb couldn't have known the modification would work. Testing required risk, required breaking rules, required ignoring official channels. Webb had done all of that. He'd saved hundreds of lives by being willing to violate regulations and prove his theory worked. Webb died in 1989 at age 82. His obituary in the Times mentioned his 40-year career at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, his work on various aerodynamic research projects, his contributions to British aviation technology. The spinner modification received one sentence. It didn't mention the rejection letters, didn't mention the unauthorized testing, didn't mention the 280 pilots whose lives his work saved. Harrison died in 2003 at age 88. His obituary mentioned his wartime service, his 19 kills, his DFC, and bar. It mentioned that he'd flown Spitfires with mirror-polished spinners that improved climb performance. It didn't mention Webb's name. Most military historians don't know the story. Aviation museums display Spitfires with polished spinners, but rarely explain why they're polished. The modification is taken for granted, assumed to be part of the original design, not recognized as a field modification that spread informally before receiving official approval. But the story matters. It matters because it shows how innovation actually happens during war, not through formal channels and approved testing programs, but through obsessive engineers who refuse to accept rejection, through ground crews willing to try unauthorized modifications, through pilots who trust their mechanics more than official specifications. The polished spinner saved hundreds of RAF pilots because one man spent 4 hours sanding metal, testing a theory that 3 supervisors had rejected as impossible. Because one squadron commander was willing to let an unauthorized engineer test his modification on combat aircraft. Because ground crews spread the technique faster than bureaucracy could stop them.